I'm going to put Stewart over here in the middle of the snow, and he's going to lead this discussion and what he sees. Now, it's really not fair for me to bring him all the way from New Zealand and then put him in a block, the first time he's ever seen it, to be able to look at it and decide what they need to do. But that's okay. Let's make this just as interactive as we can. Well, let's try this.
I could probably suggest a new rootstock.
Okay, again, but they're Jonagold. They're probably on a semi-dwarf stock, like they're probably either 106 or they could be 26, a very vigorous type, but I would say they're probably 106 or 111. They've been pruned, obviously. You can see that he brought the top down. It's not because he has an over-the-road sprayer like Terrence was doing it yesterday. It's just because he wants to bring it down and control it a little better.
He says it's not fair what he's doing to me, but he's going to do it anyway. So.
That's okay. Kurt and Bruce and everybody else has their chance too.
Well, really, I'm unfamiliar with the variety, but having a quick look at it, it's got that slightly speary look to it, so that's going to dictate a little bit about how you approach the pruning of the tree. But generally, I think that the main thing with any kind of tree, being a large one or even a very sort of high density super spindle type, you've just got to look at the space you've got available and the structure of the canopy and make sure that the major components of the canopy are being dealt with. So I'd be interested in people's comments on what has been done here. These trees have been pruned. Have they been pruned sufficiently? A lot of us aren't familiar with the environmental conditions which the growers are having to deal with, like risks of frost in the spring, or how much fruit bud you want to carry in the tree or not. But in general, for this kind of tree and this kind of spacing, does that look like a pretty a modern approach to how the tree's being pruned? Because I'm not going to tell you what I think until I've heard a little bit from some of you folk.
One comment, looking at these trees, you can really see the history of removal of the strong limbs. And, of course, some of them were maybe a little stronger than ideal before they got removed, but it's all there to see.
Exactly.
Let me just tell you that I'll just fill you in just a little bit. We're about a mile from Lake Ontario, so frosts aren't a big problem here at all. We have a very late spring because the lake causes it to be cool here. We have a late fall as well because the lake keeps it from freezing as well in the fall. So we get a fairly long growing season here. The summers rarely get over 90 degrees. It's a rare day. 2 years ago we didn't have one day over 90 degrees, and the closer you get to the lake, the cooler it is. So it's really ideal growing conditions except for the light situation, but we do get a lot of diffuse light.
I think Earl made a very good point. You can see that there's been a pretty long-term idea of renovation in the canopy here, and that's the thing that I see immediately as well, that for trees which are quite mature, I guess, at least 15,
At least
15, 20 years old, that you still have a relatively young cropping canopy on an old trunk, which is a pretty good sign for the general management approach in here. In terms of the kind of detail that's being done in these trees, I mean, I think the major issue of keeping large branches out of difficult parts of the tree in terms of shading and that is being handled reasonably well, I would say. Other people agreeing with that? Or?
Just another thing on climate and all that. No concern on these large cuts this early in the winter? Of winter damage, whatever?
Not really, because it generally
irregular bloom in the spring?
We may get some of that, but these large cuts made in the dormant are generally not a problem. We do have some black rot problems if they're made in the summer, but generally in the dormant it doesn't get below 0 degrees here. Today was an exception again, but generally it doesn't get below 0, and trees are really well hardened off since we have such a long period getting into dormancy. I want to say one more thing about this block that I didn't mention, and that this was a pretty radical approach to planting full vigor trees when wafflers put these in. And part of it was because they had so much land available, they weren't really that comfortable with the variety, and they didn't want to waste any space for it. So they jammed them up the way they should have done it, but not by planting.
And that really comes back to a little bit what Terence was saying yesterday, that if you do make a determination of your spacing and that, then you need, or you can, to a limited extent, within the vigor range that your rootstock allows you, you can modify your management approach to take account of that lack of space, and that's been done pretty well here. I'd say, looking at the particularly down the bottom here, there was probably an intention to run a wider basal part of the tree originally, and they've had to abandon that, I guess. You can see there's been a lot of major cuts made where there was some pretty big structure in the tree.
The next one over.
Right over, yeah, so they've been correcting that and keeping the upper part of the tree a little bit slimmer and with much lighter fruiting wood rolling over the fruiting cycle. This growth habit looks to me like one that you would not want to run a too vigorous renewal cycle. It hasn't got a gala type growth habit by the look of it. It's much more.
But it actually yields a lot like gala does. It'll put a lot of fruit onto one-year-old wood.
Okay.
It's very, very difficult to thin.
Right.
Is this a north-south orientation?
North is that way, right down the tree row.
So are you finding that the rows are quite wide apart? Does that help keep the crop closer to the ground?
I think so.
A fair percentage of the crop?
I think you were able to keep the bottom branches intact longer in this block than you would have otherwise because of this row spacing.
Yeah.
But also, I don't know if you remember that picture I showed yesterday of the one with the 4 bins stacked up. That's right where we were standing, where those bins were, I think. Right here, right there, right on the edge. So that's how tall these trees were before he cut them back.
Yeah.
If these are very fruitful trees and by variety and don't have a problem of setting up crop, and in fact have a difficulty of getting rid of it with thinning, then taking the approach of simple branch structures through the canopy is pretty important. So in a detail point of view, this kind of stuff here is immediately becoming a bit of a problem. You want to take this back to being a simple single limb. You really want this kind of branch structure. I know it's younger than what I'm looking at, but if you can keep that, just this idea of just straight limbs without complex branching and that kind of stuff through the canopy, just that makes a huge difference to the way in which light is going to get through the tree. So this older branch here, which is very much in my mind, even though these trees are pruned now, you've already made the decision, or you should have, to have that limb there out next year. It's getting old, the fruit is moving out to the end of it, the first foot or two near the trunk is actually just producing other secondary structures, so it could have probably come out this year as well because it's actually intruding right over the canopy here. Stuff like this just needs to be simplified just by pushing your renewal cut back up into here. You're back to a single branch. Here you've got branch rub and light problems potentially, even though it's out on the periphery of the tree.
Let me make 2 comments. This is the unfair part. First of all, again, this fruit's going for process, so yield is the name of the game. So don't worry too much about that. The second comment is Jonagold is a very heavy producing variety and very weepy. And this branch, the one that's not simplified that Stewart pointed to, will be pointing straight down at the end of this year with a few more suckers that come off the top of it. So it really doesn't influence light as much as you would think. Now there's another way that they probably could have handled this block. Anybody got any kind of idea what that might have been? If I'd come in here, I probably would have done something differently. That branch, again, that Stewart pointed to, the one that's too big, that's pointing right up the north, we've worked with a system called the palmette leader. Basically, the palmette leader has an established bottom tier of branches. We have 4 regular bottom tier branches that we try to keep. And then every branch on the east and the west side of the tree are removed from the bottom set of branches all the way up to the top, leaving only the ones in the north-south orientation. And you can imagine what the fruit sees, that light meter you were talking about yesterday, somebody was talking about what that fruit sees when you do that type of approach. The sun comes up obviously in the east. All the fruit on the east side of the tree sees the sun. It moves across the south. Noon, it's seeing the fruit on both sides, and then in the afternoon, all the fruit on the west side of the tree sees the sun as well. So it actually becomes a very productive system with good fruit quality and good bud quality.
Does the row spacing also help because you'll have more time that the sun's able to go? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with anything that Steve just said there.
Thank God.
When you have got large trees, that palmetto central leader approach that actually comes from this area, that's really an idea that Terence and Alan and you guys have worked on managing these older, mature canopies of bigger trees. We've used that same approach, borrowed the ideas from here and used that for renovating big old Granny Smith central leader trees, and certainly has made a dramatic improvement in the quality of the fruit in terms of fruit size and sugar content and that kind of thing. So that is another good approach. Although generally speaking, the canopies in here are of such good quality, even for an older tree, that I'm not sure that you need to move to the palmetto approach. Although,
I would have done that a long time ago. I wouldn't have done the big removals that they did the way they have here. Basically, they're treating this tree like almost like a vertical axe.
Absolutely.
So the point of coming here was big trees. You don't have to abandon vertical axe procedures and techniques. You can use them on these large trees. The key, though, is the spacing.
And that actually is the point that I think I was making yesterday at one stage too, and I think I showed the slide of a large tree being managed it was a lot younger than these, being managed in the same way, that this concept of branch renewal and managing the vigor by using complete branch removals and keeping that light environment very much in the focus, it just applies to any kind of tree. I have to admit that I even find myself in my garden sort of pruning some of our ornamental trees, kind of a bit like this, and just for I've got a one tree experiment in my garden at home where I'm renewal pruning a lime tree, a citrus lime tree. Now you go down to Florida and they box hedge their trees, and you can climb into the middle of a citrus tree, and it's just like a big cave. There's a circle of leaves and just a hollow center, and they just try to crop these trees. And it's a processing crop, so they don't want to put too much time in, and yet they've just got this little edge around the top of a tree, down each side, nothing in the middle. Same with avocado trees. We used to grow apple trees like that in about 1750 to 1800.
Okay, let's talk about the tops a little bit, Eric. These trees obviously for Paul were too tall. We're standing probably about 3 feet off the ground here, so they're still very tall trees. He made the decision that they were too tall, that he couldn't reach them. We had a problem this last season with internal worms, oriental fruit moth and codling moth that we haven't seen in years and years and years. People are very concerned about being able to spray these trees, covering the tops as well. So Paul decided to take these down. You can see right there, looks like the top of one of the trees, how he did it. I want Stewart's comments about how he did it and whether he would have done it any differently.
Well, if the main reason for dropping the height was actually for access to get the fruit off the tree and for picking and thinning and that kind of stuff, then clearly you just got to get them down to a height which is manageable. For pest and disease control and that kind of thing, if he's still producing good quality fruit further up and really hasn't, as major issue as maybe with spray coverage or something like that, then probably the approach that he's taken is a little bit dramatic, because you can see if this is the top of the tree, he could have just made the top less bulky by just making a renewal cut. He could have actually had that right out and just taken everything back and just kept a single one of these. He could have dropped the height of the crown of the tree and just kept that as the top. The point I'm trying to make is keeping one of these rather than 3 or 4 of them narrows the top of the tree down, so that improves immensely spray application distribution, and equally in the other direction, light getting down into the tree. But I suspect that he had a whole lot of different reasons. Looking at it after the event, what you really want to know is what is the vigor situation in these trees before you take the top out, and they're actually not bad. They're reasonably quiet. You can see there's no really, well, at least to my sort of eye anyway, they're not going crazy with excessive vigor. So you can come in and make a pretty major height reduction like has been done here, and there'll be reaction growths, but you should be able to manage those. Generally, it would be nice to try to have some kind of plan to renewing back to some a branch which or a limb which can actually overtake that role of apical dominance in the tree. I mean, he is going to get a nest of new shoots in here. Just a matter of managing his way through that.
Yeah, I agree. If you look at that. Our first version of Super Spindle on M9, Jonagold is a variety. Jonagold, for those of you who don't know, developed at the Geneva Experiment Station by Roger Way. Very popular variety in Europe about 15 years ago. Japan liked it as well, so it must have had some good qualities. Basically, they pruned and trained and planted these according to recipe, what they remembered on their trips to Europe. So it was almost a look at them horticulturally and decide what I could do, and then go ahead and do it. With a lot of assistance from people who traveled from other parts of the world to come in here and make suggestions. So that's what Dr. Werth is going to be doing for us today. He's going to be looking at these, talking about them, what he might do with them, and how he might have planted and handled them differently. Is that a big enough assignment?
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I will try to say something about how I see this orchard. But first of all, let's start with the variety. Jonagold is a three-point variety, and it is very difficult, very strong growing. So I would say very difficult to keep in a close planting, to keep in a super spin. So I would already be afraid to keep Jonagold in a very close spacing, but I see someone here 1 meter or 3 feet, even more than 3 feet. That looks to me okay, but I wouldn't go closer than to 1 meter with a variety like Jonagold. If you see on the right side here, this is already there is alt of it. If you look at the lower part, that's the branches and weak growing lateral branches, how I like it. And if you look at the upper part, you see the result. It's a 5-year-old trees. How can you manage these trees in other 5 years? You might have some problems. So in my opinion, Jonagold is not the best variety to grow closer than 3 feet or 11 feet. You can do, but of course you might have more problems than if you plant it in a more far and more distance, like here, for instance. Yeah, that's my first opinion about the variety. So I would say if one risk on very intensive plantings, as we have talked about yesterday, higher than 4,000 or 5,000 trees per hectare, or let's say 4,000 or 5,000 trees per hectare, then in my opinion it can be Braeburn, very weak growing, it can be Gala, already a little bit more difficult, and for sure it's more difficult for Jonagold and Fuji, for instance. Yeah, that's general speaking. Now about the trees here, yeah, what can I tell you? I think if I would try such a close planting, I would do since the beginning a little bit more on, would do a little bit bending, because then it would help you easier to keep growth down. But instead of bending, all the branches, the stronger branches, has been already removed. For instance, like a branch like this, if it would have been bended down 1 year ago, or even other ones than the other one there, then it would be easier to control shoot growth. But generally speaking, it's not so bad being a Jonagold in the 5th year, but how will it look in 3 or 5 years from now? That's the question in the too close plantings. So let's hear a little bit your opinion. On the whole, growth is not so bad, so I think he can get through for other 5 years, but then he might have some more problems. On the pruning, I agree with the system that he tries to remove the top, the strong growing on the top. I would never allow branches like this, and probably Stewart would agree with me. I would do this, for instance, I showed you, and if you rub it down, then you don't have a very little reaction. Yeah, and that's the problem. If you leave a branch like this, it has, the first year it has been this, the second year this. If with a max machine you bend it down this last year to this direction, then you wouldn't have it strong growing up, down, up as it is now. So I think you cannot grow in a close, in a very intensive way without bending. So that helps you to do things easier. And another thing I don't like to see is to do the cutting like this at the level, at this high level. You can do this perhaps on this branch or on this branch, because you have to do it sooner or later, because the flower buds are going, or the branches are going. It's not yet a problem now, but anyway, cutting back can be done at when the wood had already fruits on it for 2-3 years, but it's absolutely not allowed to do it on this height. Probably Steve will, or you will agree, and Stewart will agree with me.
It's too heavy a branch for there.
Yeah, because with this cutting back in this way, what's the reaction? Now, what do you do it now? Next year it will be up double than this. Therefore, or if a branch like this has been bended down very strongly, then you have a better chance. Yeah, that's my opinion. For instance, all this now, of course, they will break down, but if a 1-year-old branch has been bended down in this way, then you get flower buds much easier. You have a branch like this.
Now, why can he get away with this type of wood? Yesterday we were looking at this type of wood on Gala, and we said we can't get away with that. Our fruit's going to be too small, there's going to be too many, we won't be able to thin it off. You know why we can get away with that on Jonagold? Triploid. It's a large fruited variety, so size doesn't mean as much on Jonagold. So you're really looking for this weaker pendant wood. The other thing about this is that again, people are looking for as much crop as they can, and these branches would have been really nice branches if they'd taken care of them last year or the year before. Maybe not by bending down. I don't think we do that here very much anymore.
Yeah, but then you better choose a wider planting, because look at this tree below and up here. Look at the vegetation. If you add all these branches, then you have, I don't know, 5 meters of growth up here. And what's downstairs, down? And it continues in this way. So.
I should never argue with an expert, but you
you should. You have not to agree with me.
You know what's wrong with this branch, with this planting? I don't think it's because they're too close together. I think it's because they're too wide, too far apart. They're kind of a hybrid system now. He doesn't know what to do with these branches. He's trying to fill some space. Super spindle, I don't think you need to fill space with branches. He'd be better off if this was this close instead of a meter apart. He would have looked at these and preserved these rather than using these large ones and thinking that I can fill some more space here. I can grow these out further. So I think this is a hybrid system that's too far apart.
A good job.
So what do you think about him bringing the height down here in the winter?
Yeah, it's already a problem. You cannot allow to have branches strong like this here. So now what are you doing? If you remove it, then the reaction will be very strongly. So don't leave branches like this this high since the beginning. For instance, in this case, you would remove this already.
Yeah,
I don't like the smell.
yeah.
Except I'm not strong enough to pull it.
You don't need much stronger shoot growth on the top, but it's already a big pruning to do it now.
Yeah.
It's not allowed to have stronger branches in the close planting than this. If you do every year this, next year it may be an exception, but next year you have to remove this for sure. Yeah.
Okay, now I know everybody knows, but explain why you ripped them. Why didn't you just cut them?
No, I tried to explain it yesterday because if you do this with the cutting, you sometimes have a reaction like this. Huh? So stronger branches, and by wrapping down, you have less reaction.
Most of you probably know all about ripping, but there's adventitious buds underneath each of these shoots, and when you make a cut, those buds will be stimulated and they'll come out and you'll get a nice big shoot like that. By ripping those, you're actually taking all those buds that surround that right out of the tree, and you won't get that type of growth. You may get a small piece a year or 2 years from now, but you won't get it immediately.
Yeah, but it's not such important to do this. Let's talk about the branches and not about the pruning. See over there, there are two branches. It's not allowed to leave both of them. You see? Yeah, cut them off or wrap them off.
Point those out, Stewart.
Now, this could be an exception, but the other one for sure is not allowed to remain. And the next one, if you, with the max machine, you bend it down in summertime, then you have a carbon on top.